course of British justice. Prosecuting protestors of genocide as terrorists exists at odds with common law applied equally to all, interfering with the course of justice. Here's my story of British justice, read by Andrew Browl. Adler v. Broulidakis, 2015, is a case ruled in British law in which British Law Society members knowingly relied on assured indemnity to interfere with the course of British justice. English common law began in the late 12th century during the reign of King Henry II. English common law is still widely used today in a process that applies past court decisions, precedent, to guide new rulings, incorporating common sense. About 1/3 of the world lives under a common law system or a mixed system that includes it. Judges look at older, similar cases to make good common sense decisions, applying common sense that is obvious in the most reasonable version of what common sense may be. The success or failure of law depends on legal codes being seen to apply equally to all, without bias or special indemnity or exemption from appeal. Central to a working judiciary is the jury trial, exactly as the original Athenian democracy recognized as a key protection from corruption in the court system. Presidents, lawmakers, police officers, judges must obey the exact same rules as ordinary citizens, or the rule of law is ended. What follows an end to rule of law is rule by law. Laws made by biased members of the Law Society who interfere with the course of justice by manipulating law to indemnify themselves when making judgments they know are illegal only ever leads to one place. Absolute power in the lawmaking business leads to absolute corruption every time. When lawmakers place above the law they write, able to write new laws undoing common law precedent, overriding common sense with indemnified, "it's true because I said so" nonsense, it's not difficult to see how the fabric of the system is undermined, affecting the majority to a detriment proportional to the advantage it rewards the small, chosen few lawmakers. On June 23, 2025, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, a member of Labour Friends of Israel, acting on behalf of Prime Minister Starmer, a long-term member of the parliamentary group Labour Friends of Israel, announced the decision to proscribe the Palestine Action anti-genocide protest group following an incident where anti-genocide activists sprayed red paint on military aircraft at an RAF base. On July 2, 2025, members of Parliament, comprising mostly Friends of Israel, passed the law supporting the proscription of Palestine Action by a vote of 385 to 26 in the House of Commons. The 26 who voted against the proscription were not Friends of Israel. The majority of the 385 who voted to approve the pro-genocide bill are Friends of Israel, including Home Office Minister Dan Jarvis, a member and supporter of Labour Friends of Israel since October 2011, when he participated in a Labour Friends of Israel-led parliamentary delegation to Israel and the Palestinian territories. June 3rd, the law was codified by the Lords, populated in the majority by signatories who are Friends of Israel. Labour Friends of Israel has previously stated it counts around 37 peer supporters in the House of Lords. Conservative Friends of Israel and Liberal Democrat Friends of Israel also feature active parliamentary members and vice presidents among peers, such as Lord Palmer for the Lord Democrats. Stuart Pollack, Baron Pollack, CBE, is a British Conservative politician, life peer in the House of Lords and honorary president of the Conservative Friends of Israel, heavily identified as the friendliest friend of Israel through his long-term leadership of the pro-genocide group Conservative Friends of Israel. On July 5, 2025, the Friends of Israel Palestine Action ban came into force, making membership or supporting Palestine Action a criminal offence under the Terrorism Act 2000. Under British common law in Parliament and the Lords, the Law Society passed a bill actively supporting genocide for Friends of Israel, was passed by Friends of Israel, interfering with the course of British justice. Genocide in all its stages of conspiracy and assistance was illegal until this judgment. The vast majority of British people who the government represents are not pro-genocide. The law criminalising anti-genocide protests as terrorism is not representative of British common law. It is, in its overarching effect, a crime against the British people who trust their law to represent the will of the people in the belief that there can be no harmony in a lawless society. When a genocide entity actively engaged in the most deviant genocide in history, represented by the moniker Friends of Israel, is allowed to pass laws through British courts supporting the right to genocide by jailing anti-genocide protesters as terrorists, then clearly British law is seen to be under the rule of Zionist law operated by Friends of Israel, who are no friends of British law. British citizens opposed to this Zionist takeover of British common law aiding and abetting genocide during an act of genocide have come out in droves to protest. More than 3,500 people have been arrested in the UK for expressing support for or protesting the ban on Palestine Action since the group was proscribed under the Terrorism Act 2000 in July of 2025. Many of these martyr protesters are octogenarians who feel strongly about the UK government's role in sponsoring genocide under the manufactured deceit that it is lawful. On August 9, 2025, Miles Pickering was one of 532 protesters arrested by police under the terrorism law, threatening 14 years of incarceration alongside violent criminals during a protest in Parliament Square. His T-shirt read, "I support Plasticine Action." British common law by Friends of Israel. British common law arrested a middle-aged engineer from Brighton for plasticine offences in a demonstration of ironclad support for the Zionist right to keep on with their genocide without the nuisance of protests from a British public who do not support genocide or even the creation of the largest child amputee population in history. Many of the child amputees in Palestine were maimed by child-harming drone sniper platforms manufactured by Albert Systems in Bristol, which is where the protesters currently in jail as terrorists were arrested while protesting the British government aiding and abetting genocide during an active genocide. The enforcement methods of British law are no secret. In the most recent example, Jewish activist Tony Greenstein, 72, a fierce critic of Hamas and a fierce critic of genocide, was dragged through the courts, facing a 14-year jail sentence in a trial run by a pro-genocide judge that would have seen him jailed but for one thing: the jury system. Juries comprising ordinary British people and not exclusively Friends of Israel. Small wonder then that the Friends of Israel in Parliament and the Lords work tirelessly to end jury trials, ensuring single individuals can pass judgments that are decided before the first word is spoken in court. The judge chosen to sentence Tony Greenstein to 14 years as a terrorist, Judge Sarah Plashkis, spewed bile and venom when her determination to have Tony Greenstein convicted was thwarted by the jury judgment in August of 2026. Pro-genocide Judge Plashkis repeatedly interfered with the defendant's right to speak in his defense. My first-hand experience of British law goes back to 1985 when I emigrated to England. Since then, I've had some interaction with the High Court, including as an expert witness, enabling me to meet and get to know several leading law society professionals. My field of expertise, though, is family law. That is why I've written a book about British law. Adler v. Broulidakis 2015 is an in-depth retelling of a case that was heard in the British court system in 2015. Although it may be difficult for me to be objective in this observation, I think it's up there as an example of the most blatant criminality by inherently corrupt members of the Law Society in the history of British law, in which criminality by members of the Law Society has many storied moments to reflect on. British common law has progressed since it was legal to trade slaves and illegal to protest slave trading. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, is often cited as a reminder that eventually the truth will out, even when the lawmakers devise secrecy laws indemnifying themselves from appeal and from reporting of their criminality. Judge Michelle O'Leary was the judge who switched with the judge set down for the hearing in the case my ex-girlfriend, the family lawyer, brought against me to trade visitation with our 5-year-old son in exchange for around £3 million. O'Leary interfered with justice, eventually stealing at a minimum some £3 million from me by lying and then writing that lie into law. £3 million in 2015 is close to £5 million today, excluding interest. In her judgment, O'Leary knowingly and deliberately ruled to end my young son's right to see his father again. Thanks to Michelle O'Leary's judgment, Byron has not been able to see me or speak to me since February of 2016. Byron is 17 years old now. He was 6 when he last saw me. What value the damages claim for those lost years? How do you calculate damages for a life of opportunity for a 6-year-old child that was ended by a judge who lied? Adler v. Broulidakis 2015 is a non-fiction trilogy being part autobiography of a Greek, South African, English-American, part historical account of Britain's common law system, and part actual court judgment establishing legal precedent in which the law is what the chosen few lawmakers say it is. A legal system that has emerged into today's version of laws made by an unelected legal body who pass laws for their own benefit at the expense of British common law for the majority, free from any consequences. The legal component underpinning my historical review of British law in this book follows the premise of history told by the victors, that follows a wider context in which a society educated to accept an official narrative approved by the victors' experts who control the law follows a common methodology going back to the early days of empire. Laws made for and by the rich, without checks and balances, limiting the rights of the lawmakers in a system of manufactured amnesia intended to override historical transgressions in which lawmakers controlling regulation of their exclusive narrative only ever produces the same outcome. When the law becomes whatever the court says it is, without regard for actual evidence or common sense, that methodology consolidating absolute power for the court corrupts absolutely. When the lawmakers can tell the press what they can and cannot report, as was the case in Adler v. Broulidakis 2015, it becomes too easy for corrupt judges to conceal their criminality, often to the point they don't need to even pretend they act lawfully. Common sense tells us that absolute power corrupts absolutely. My book examines the question, should any lawmaker in a British court have absolute power free from any oversight, common sense checks and balances, indefinitely, creating new precedent for more illegal laws to cite in more corrupt judgments. What do we expect will happen if corrupt judgments are allowed to stand indefinitely? Common sense is a recurring theme in this story. Common law in Britain is based on judicial precedent, case law, and custom-related common sense, rather than a codified constitution. Common sense is the single commonality following the most significant advances in British law. For example, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 effectively abolished the crime of witchcraft, when common sense ended the entitlement for misogynistic religious white men to burn women at the stake if the evidence showed they floated when placed in water. Floating proved the defendant, who was always a woman, was made of wood and was therefore condemned as a witch. That was the law for hundreds of years. The law changes slowly along checks and balances applied on the rails of common sense. We measure the success and the failure of laws for the common good along this line of common sense. Imagine if by 2026 there was still a place in British law allowing judgment to be codified by the hand of lawmakers, unregulated by effective checks and balances, empowered to pass judgment free from appeal, able to persecute legal protest illegally. When lies are made law applied by the liars who made the law, it becomes rule by lying law, not rule of law. That is common sense. The opposite to rule of law is not anarchy, it is rule by law. Rule by law is rule by force. Rule by force is war, not law. Organized crime rules by law. The function of a working judiciary in a rule of law is to end rule by law. Mussolini ruled by law. Hitler ruled by law. Trump rules by law. Number 10 rules by law. Rule by law is rule by the few at the expense of the many, who traditionally expect representation in egalitarian rule of law. Rule of law is how rule by law is ended. Rule by law in family court is the most pernicious, unaccountable legal entity currently operating as the opposite to rule of law by monetizing abuse of children for the benefit of law society members. This is a shameful past in which a prevailing culture of secrecy, reward, and self-protection for an entitled elite led to unnecessary suffering for many victims and their families. Any legal system is only as strong as its weakest precedent. Assured indemnity with no statute of limitations allows a culture of criminality into the court service that ensures John Major was not wrong in his assessment. There can be no harmony in a lawless society. I do hope you will read my book about this court case. The law matters enormously. What happens to anyone under British law can happen to anyone else. Without rule of law, we will not repair what is clearly broken in Britain. Thank you for listening, and don't forget you can read the entire text of this blog on Andrew Brell's Substack, and you'll find links to the book there as well. The book is Adler v. Broulidakis 2015, and it's available in various formats via Amazon.